When you think about the giants of the semiconductor industry, the companies that build the digital world, you probably don't picture potato country. But the story of Micron technology, it's one of the great, improbable tales in all of business, a true defiance of all the odds. I mean, let's be real. The map of the digital revolution is pretty much drawn through Silicon Valley, Tokyo, and Seoul. It is not supposed to run through the high desert of Boise, Idaho. And yet, this is where the last American maker of memory chips was born, survived, and actually thrived. So, how on earth did that happen? And that's really the heart of this story. It's a company that, by any logical measure, just shouldn't exist. It's the ultimate underdog tale, and it starts in the most unlikely of places.
All right, so to really get what makes Micron so special, you first have to understand the absolutely brutal market they decided to jump into and the specific product that became their entire world.
Micron makes something called DRAM, Dynamic Random Access Memory. Basically, it's the short-term memory your computer uses to juggle all its tasks. But here's the key. Unlike a super complex processor from Intel, DRAM is a commodity. Think of it like crude oil. It's all about volume and price, dictated by these ruthless global supply and demand cycles. In a market like this, just being innovative isn't enough. You have to be efficient to an obsessive, almost fanatical degree.
So how does a company from Boise, Idaho even think about competing in a cutthroat market like that? Well, it all starts with 4 guys in a basement who, believe it or not, had a much, much safer plan at first. So in 1978, the founders get together in the basement of a dental office. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. It's pure startup lore. And their first gig? It's a big one. They get a contract to design a state-of-the-art 64K DRAM chip for an established company. See, the plan was to be the brains, not the builder. And this was a really smart, low-risk way to go. They could use their incredible engineering talent without having to raise hundreds of millions of dollars for a giant factory or a fab. It was the sensible path. But as you'll see, the chip world is rarely sensible. And this is where the story takes a massive turn. An event completely out of their control just blows up their safe, sensible plan. And it forces them into a decision that would define the company forever. So, first, the good news. They absolutely knocked their first contract out of the park. They designed a fantastic, world-class chip that was ready for prime time, their work was done, and it was brilliant. And then, disaster. Their one and only client, Mostech, gets bought by another company. And you know how it is in the world of corporate mergers. Projects get reevaluated, priorities shift. Suddenly, their customer was part of this huge new machine. And just like that, the contract was gone. In the corporate reshuffle, their project got the axe. And the tiny consulting firm in that Boise basement, they just lost their entire business. So just imagine you're in their shoes for a second. You've got this incredible world-beating design, but the one company that was supposed to build it just vanished. Do you just pack it all in? Do you try to shop the design around? Or do you do something kind of crazy? They chose crazy. They decided, you know what? We're gonna make this thing ourselves. This plan went against every piece of business advice you could possibly get. A tiny team in Idaho competing with global giants? It was absurd. But to even try, they needed one thing: a ton of money. So, their search for cash didn't lead them to some venture capitalist on Sand Hill Road. Nope. It led them to a local Idaho legend, a man who was the absolute polar opposite of a tech investor. Everybody, meet J.R. Simplot. This guy's life story is just incredible. He drops out of school at 14, builds an empire selling dehydrated potatoes to the military in World War II, and then, get this, makes a handshake deal with Ray Kroc to supply all the frozen fries for McDonald's. This was not your typical tech visionary. This was a man who understood farming, grit, and how to operate at a massive scale. And this quote right here, it tells you everything. Simplot saw that the world was changing. He understood that value wasn't just about muscle anymore. It was about intelligence. He saw his own hustle in these engineers just apply to this new, invisible technology. He was betting on the local guys. So even though his own financial advisors told him he was nuts, Simplot wrote a check for $1 million. And in return, he got a 40% stake in the company. It was a pure gut instinct bet on the people and the sheer audacity of their plan. But Simplot's investment was about so much more than just the money. It was a cultural infusion. It fundamentally shaped Micron's DNA and made it different from every other tech company on the planet.
See, Simplot brought something called patient capital. He was a farmer. He was used to planting seeds, waiting for them to grow, and then harvesting. He wasn't some VC looking for a quick exit in 3 years. That long-term thinking was absolutely essential for surviving the boom and bust chip market. His money built their first factory, and his incredible personality, the guy drove a Lincoln with Mr. Spud on the license plate, that became part of Micron's identity.
It's like you had two totally different worlds. Over here, you've got the polished, elite world of Silicon Valley, funded by VCs who want a quick return. And over here, you have Micron, funded by a potato farmer, valuing things like frugality, grit, and this rugged, us-against-the-world mentality.
All right, today we're gonna dive into what is, no joke, one of the greatest underdog stories in the history of tech. It's about how this small, basically unknown company from Idaho managed to survive an industry-wide catastrophe that literally wiped out giants. To really get how improbable this all is, you have to start right here with this quote, the Podunk Company. That's what the so-called experts thought of Micron. They were a joke, completely overlooked, and given basically zero chance of survival. But they had a secret weapon, and it all started in a really, really tough time for American tech.
So let's set the stage. The year is 1981, and for the American semiconductor industry, things are looking bleak. A perfect storm was brewing, and honestly, the US was getting hammered.
Just look at the contrast here. On one side, you've got the American chip makers, and they are really struggling to keep up. But on the other side, you have these Japanese juggernauts. We're talking Toshiba, Hitachi, NEC, and they're backed by their government. They have this relentless focus on manufacturing, and they are pumping out high-quality chips at a scale the American firms just couldn't touch. It was a full-blown crisis.
And into this absolute bloodbath, this high-stakes battle, steps our hero, Micron Technology, a tiny, scrappy company from Boise, Idaho, of all places. They knew they couldn't outspend the competition, so they were going to have to outthink them.
So what was their big plan? What was the secret weapon? Well, it wasn't about building bigger factories or anything like that. Nope. It was all about engineering brilliance, a strategy they simply called the shrink. Okay, to understand their whole strategy, you just have to get this one core concept, die size. Just think of it like the physical footprint of a single chip on a piece of silicon. And in this world, in semiconductors, smaller is everything. It's the absolute holy grail. And here's why the shrink was such a game changer. It's pretty simple, actually. A smaller die means you can physically fit more chips onto a single silicon wafer. More chips per wafer means, boom, the cost for each individual chip goes way down. That means you can sell them for less than your competitors. And here's the kicker, a smaller chip is actually less likely to have a defect, which gives you a higher yield, basically more working chips in every batch. It was just a massive economic advantage. And get this, by 1983, Micron's engineers pulled off a total technological coup. They managed to shrink their 64K DRAM chip, that's dynamic random access memory, all the way down to just 22,000 square mils. That was way smaller, and therefore way cheaper to make, than anything coming from the giants like Motorola or Texas Instruments. And the timing of this breakthrough? Oh, it couldn't have been more perfect. Micron's huge cost advantage meant they were perfectly positioned to ride the massive wave of the personal computer boom. All of a sudden, their cheaper chips had customers lining up. The home computer market was just exploding, and Micron became a key supplier for one of the most iconic machines ever built, the Commodore 64. Only the best-selling computer of all time. This demand was just rocket fuel for their growth. And in June of 1984, it all seemed to come together. The potato farmer's bet, as the critics called it, paid off with a super successful IPO. It really looked like the underdog had made it, but the party was about to come to a screeching halt. Right as Micron was popping the champagne, the entire market just collapsed. 1985 brought a brutal, industry-wide crash that was going to test every single company to its absolute breaking point. So what the heck happened? Well, it was a classic case of what economists call the hog cycle. Basically, the whole industry got way too optimistic. They all built way too many factories expecting this endless demand, but it just didn't show up fast enough. With the Japanese fabs still flooding the market with chips, the result was a catastrophic glut. And I don't mean prices just dipped. They fell off a cliff. A memory chip that cost dollars in 1984 was selling for pennies just 1 year later. Pennies. For American manufacturers, this was nothing short of an extinction-level event. You want to know how bad it got? Look no further than Intel. Yeah, that Intel. the company that literally invented the DRAM chip back in 1968, even they decided to just get out of the memory business completely. Their own leaders admitted they just couldn't compete. And Intel wasn't the only one. It was a mass exodus. Most tech sold and taken apart. National Semiconductor, AMD, one by one, the American giants just ran for the hills, leaving the entire field to the Japanese conglomerates. So, after the dust finally settled from the great crash of 1985, what was actually left of the American DRAM industry? The answer is pretty shocking. In 1984, you had a whole roster of American companies making these chips. By the end of 1985, there was only one, just one left. You guessed it, the podunk company from Idaho, Micron. But let's be clear, this was not some glorious victory. Survival was ugly. It was brutal. Micron was hemorrhaging cash. Its stock price had completely collapsed. The company had to go through massive, painful layoffs just to keep the lights on. They survived, sure, but just barely. So let's just start with a question that gets right to the heart of this whole thing. Imagine you're making a fantastic product, but your competitors are literally selling theirs for less than it even cost them to make it. What do? Well, for a company called Micron Technology back in the 80s, this wasn't just some thought experiment. It was a full-blown company-killing crisis. The year is 1985. The battlefield? The global semiconductor market. Micron's leaders were just convinced they weren't being out-innovated, they felt like they were being cheated. So they reached into their toolkit and pulled out a totally different kind of weapon. And that kicked off what you can only really describe as a war in the chip aisle. For the folks running Micron, this wasn't just business as usual. No, this was a fight for their very survival against what they saw as a completely unfair system. The one word at the center of this entire firestorm was dumping. This was the core of Micron's whole complaint. They were arguing that Japanese companies were deliberately selling memory chips for a loss in the United States, all with the goal of driving American companies like them straight out of business. So how'd they prove it? Well, Micron's lawyers laid out a pretty clear, damning case. They showed that these huge losses on chips were being covered by massive profits from other divisions, consumer electronics like TVs and VCRs. And they argued the goal was brutally simple: wipe out the American competition, get a monopoly, and then, boom, jack up the prices for everybody. And the engine that made this whole strategy possible, it was something called the Keiretsu system. You can think of it like a tight-knit family of interconnected Japanese companies, usually with a big bank right at the center. This structure made it super easy to shuffle money around, to cross-subsidize, and to get the low-interest loans you'd need to survive a long, drawn-out price war. For Micron, this was the smoking gun. But here's the thing. Just complaining about unfair business practices, that wasn't going to be enough to get Washington, D.C. to pay attention. If Micron was going to survive, they needed a much bigger hook. They had to turn this from a business problem into a national security threat. And this is where Micron's leader, Joe Parkinson, made an absolutely brilliant move. He completely reframed the debate. He argued this wasn't just about his company's bottom line. It was about America's technological sovereignty. Losing the ability to make our own memory chips, he said, would be like giving up control over the oil of the information age. It would affect everything from your home computer to the most advanced military weapons. And you know what? It worked. The timing couldn't have been better. The Reagan administration was already getting really nervous about the huge trade deficit with Japan. So Micron files its petition in 1985, and just over a year later, in September of '86, a major international agreement gets signed. I mean, that is lightning speed for government action.
Now, this agreement, it absolutely saved Micron, but not everyone was celebrating. The deal itself became a really controversial lifeline.
The whole deal really boiled down to two main things. First, it set up a price floor. That basically made it illegal for Japanese companies to sell chips below a certain price in the US. And second, it pushed Japan to open up its own market, with the goal of letting US companies grab a 20% market share over there. The reaction was just completely split down the middle. For Micron, obviously, it was a lifesaver. It stopped the bleeding, financially speaking, and let them get back to being profitable. But if you were one of the big American computer makers like Apple or IBM, you saw this as pure protectionism that artificially drove up the cost of the parts you desperately needed. So the trade war was over. Micron had won. But it left a really deep mark on the company's culture. The Micron that came out the other side was tougher. It was more aggressive, and it was about to get a leader who was a perfect match for that new identity.
Yeah, Micron had learned a very hard lesson. Your lawyers can be just as valuable as your engineers. This new, battle-hardened culture of scrappy fighting meant that the old-school, suit-and-tie executive just wasn't going to cut it anymore.
And that's where Steve Appleton comes in. I mean, his rise is it's unbelievable. He starts at Micron in 1983, working the night shift on the factory floor. By 1991, he's only 31 years old and they name him president. Just 3 years after that, he's the chairman and CEO. He went from the night shift to the corner office in just over a decade. It's wild.
Appleton was pretty much the definition of an anti-CEO. He was a former pro tennis player, for one. He actually understood the manufacturing process because he'd done the work himself, and his whole personality was built on risk. He was famous for these high-octane hobbies. We're talking stunt piloting, off-road racing, the whole deal. So Appleton takes the company's scrappy, survivor attitude and just cranks it up to 11. He forges it into a permanent corporate identity. He wasn't just leading a company anymore, he was building a junkyard dog.
And that phrase, it just perfectly captures the culture he built at Micron. It wasn't about being polished or looking pretty. It was about being tough, being resourceful, and being relentlessly, unapologetically competitive.
And this whole ethos translated into how they did things day in and day out. Extreme frugality meant things like reusing chemicals and running their equipment way past its recommended lifespan. Operational efficiency came from having a really flat management structure so decisions could be made in a snap. And maybe most important of all, Appleton believed you had to embrace risk. You had to actually thrive in the chaotic, violent up and down cycles of the memory business.
How does a company manage to triple its size right in the middle of a massive global financial crisis without spending a single dollar in cash? It sounds impossible, right? Well, today we're diving into the incredible story of Micron Technology's audacious 90s gamble. It's a tale of brilliant, high-stakes deals, some painful lessons, and the moves that truly defined a tech giant. Let's get into it. All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll set the stage with the absolute battlefield that was the memory market, a real three-front war. Then we'll look at the masterstroke, an unbelievable no-cash acquisition. After that, a little detour into a risky PC experiment, before we wrap it all up with the ultimate lesson here, the art of focus. You have to remember, the 90s were an explosion. The personal computer wasn't just a niche hobby anymore, it was becoming essential. And with the rise of the internet, all these new machines were incredibly hungry for one thing: memory chips. We're talking DRAM. But for the companies actually making those chips, it was an all-out global war. Yeah, this slide really shows you how the whole game was changing. See, back in the 80s, Japan was the undisputed champion of memory chips. But by the 90s, they were starting to lose their grip. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, you've got this new powerhouse emerging, South Korea. We're talking giants like Samsung and Hyundai, and they came in with a devastatingly simple strategy: build enormous factories, flood the market with chips, and just crush prices for everybody. And suddenly, Micron, the American leader, was caught in this brutal three-way fight for survival. And it all boiled down to this one simple, brutal fact: get big or die. Building a new factory to make these chips, what they call a fab, cost billions of dollars. You couldn't be a small player anymore. You'd just get squeezed out. So for Micron, this wasn't about ambition. Getting bigger, and getting bigger fast, was the only way they were going to make it through. So this intense pressure cooker environment is what sets the stage for Micron's single most important moment. It's 1998, the Asian financial crisis is in full swing. Chip prices are in the toilet, and Micron makes a move that to anyone on the outside looked completely insane. But as you're about to see, it was pure genius. The whole opportunity came from two companies with the exact opposite problems. You had Micron, who desperately needed to grow to survive but was totally strapped for cash because of the downturn. And then you had another American icon, Texas Instruments, who was desperate to get out of the chaotic memory business. They wanted to focus on the much more profitable chips for the new mobile phone market. TI's desperation created this perfect once-in-a-lifetime opening for Micron. And this wasn't just some standard acquisition. No way. What they came up with was one of the most creative, most brilliantly structured deals in tech history. It was a masterclass in solving everyone's problems in a way that just seemed impossible. Okay, here's the first jaw-dropping part. The amount of actual cash that Micron paid for the entire global memory business of Texas Instruments was zero. A big, fat nothing. They pulled off this massive, transformative acquisition without touching a single dollar of their cash reserves. So how on earth did they do that? Well, instead of cash, they paid with stock. They essentially went to Texas Instruments and said, look, we don't have the cash, but what we can do is give you a piece of our future. Bet on us to turn this business around and we'll both win. And this is the part that is just absolutely mind-blowing. Not only did Micron pay zero cash, but Texas Instruments, this seller, actually gave Micron $750 million in low-interest financing. Think about that. The company getting rid of the business was so eager to do the deal that they basically financed the buyer to take it off their hands and upgrade the factories. It's just unbelievable. The result was immediate. It was massive. Just like that, overnight, Micron's manufacturing capacity tripled. They went from being mostly a US company to a true global player, with facilities in Texas, Italy, Singapore, you name it. This single, brilliant deal gave them the scale they desperately needed to stand toe-to-toe with the biggest players in the world, like Samsung. But you know, not every big swing Micron took in the 90s was a home run. At the very same time they were fighting this war in the chip market, they were also running another really fascinating and kind of risky experiment. They were trying to become their own biggest customer by building and selling their own PCs. The business school term for this is vertical integration. And the logic, on paper, it seems to make perfect sense, right? If you're making all these memory chips, why not just build the computers that use them? That way, you create a guaranteed customer for your own product. It's a closed loop. And for a while there, it really looked like it was working. They jumped in back in '91, and by the middle of the decade, Micron PCs were a real thing. They were actually giving giants like Dell and Gateway a run for their money. But as you can see from this timeline, it was just a chapter, not the whole book. So what was the problem? Well, this quote really hits the nail on the head. The PC market was an absolute bloodbath. The profit margins were razor thin. But even more important was that last part. It was a huge distraction. All the brainpower and energy the company spent worrying about building and shipping PCs was brainpower that wasn't being spent on their main business, designing and manufacturing world-class memory chips. And that was the hard lesson. That beautiful idea of synergy that looked so good on paper, it just wasn't panning out in the real world. In fact, the PC business was actually becoming an anchor, dragging the courtship business down. So recognizing that painful truth, Micron made the really tough but really smart decision to sell off the PC division and get back to what they did best. Okay, so let's pull back. What can we learn from this wild, high-stakes decade at Micron? You've got one story of a brilliant company-defining acquisition, and another story of a really instructive but ultimately failed experiment. Let's pull out the big lessons here. I think it boils down to 4 key things. First, be a bold opportunist. When everyone else is panicking during a downturn, that's when the best deals are made. Second, get creative with financing. A lack of cash doesn't have to stop you from making big moves. Third, and this is a big one, understand the peril of distraction. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. And finally, the most important lesson of all, core competency is king. Know what you are truly great at and focus on that relentlessly. All right, let's talk about one of the most important high-stakes battles in the history of the personal computer. This was a war fought in the late 90s that literally decided what kind of memory is sitting inside the device you're using to watch this right now. This is the story of RDRAM versus DDR. And it really all starts with a question you might have had yourself. You've seen the letters, right? DDR, DDR4, now DDR5 whenever you look at tech specs. But have you ever stopped to think about what DDR actually is and why that technology became the standard for the entire world? Well, it wasn't an accident. It was the result of a brutal industry war. Okay, so to really get what this war was all about, we have to understand the problem everyone was facing. And back in the late 1990s, the whole PC industry was staring down the barrel of a massive, massive technical problem. See, the gigahertz race was in full swing. You had companies like Intel and AMD in this absolute mad dash to make their processors faster and faster. Breaking speed records, it felt like every other month. The issue was the memory, the RAM that has to feed all the data to these incredibly fast CPUs, it just couldn't keep up. And you can just see the problem right here on this chart. CPU speeds were just exploding, shooting straight up, while memory speeds were kind of slowly plodding along. This created this huge performance gap. I mean, who cares how fast your processor is if it's always sitting around, waiting, just starved for data?
The industry was about to hit a wall, and a totally new memory standard was the only way forward. And into this crisis, two very, very different solutions emerged, each one backed by a totally different philosophy. And this thing got heated. It wasn't just some dry technical debate. People in the industry at the time started calling it a religious war for the soul of the personal computer. So, on one side you had RDRAM. This was the big revolutionary idea, and it was backed by the undisputed king of the industry, Intel. It was a brand new, super high-speed technology, but, and this is the really important part, it was proprietary. On the other side, you had DDR-SDRAM. This was the evolutionary approach, backed by a kind of rebel alliance of memory makers like Micron. It just built on the tech they already had, but cleverly doubled the speed. And the most crucial difference? It was an open, royalty-free standard. Now, for those companies that actually make the memory, Intel's choice of RDRAM was, frankly, terrifying. It wasn't just that they'd have to pay huge royalties to this company called Rambus for every single chip they made. They'd also have to completely retool their factories, deal with new issues like the chips running way hotter, and then the engineers found the biggest problem of all. The real-world performance just wasn't there. All that amazing speed on paper was often canceled out by high latency, basically a delay before the data started flowing. So for a company like Micron, this wasn't just some business disagreement. This was an existential threat. If Intel and Rambus got their way, their entire business model would be destroyed. They really had no choice but to fight back. And that is exactly what they did. The battle lines were drawn. The Great Memory War had begun. And this wasn't going to be fought in some secret lab. This was going to be fought out in the open, in the marketplace, where you, the consumers and PC builders, would ultimately be the ones to decide who won. And things escalated fast. In '96, Intel made its big move, signing this exclusive deal with Rambus. That set the whole thing in motion. Then, in 2000, the moment of truth. The brand new, super hyped Pentium 4 processor launched, and it only worked with that expensive RDRAM. But the market backlash was so huge and so immediate that just 1 year later, Intel completely caved. So what happened in that one crazy year? Well, first off, sticker shock. The second the Pentium 4 hit store shelves, everybody from the hardcore PC enthusiasts to just regular people wanting a new computer took one look at the sky-high price of the RDRAM you were forced to buy with it and just balked. It made building a new PC way more expensive than anyone was ready for. But the real killer blow was performance. Independent reviews started coming out, and they all revealed RDRAM's dirty little secret. All that bandwidth it promised on paper didn't matter because of that high latency we talked about. In tons of real-world tests, systems using the much, much cheaper DDR memory were just as fast. And in some cases, they were actually faster. And that was pretty much it. The kingmaker, Intel, had made its choice, but the market simply refused to go along. In the end, it was the wallets of everyday people that cast the final, deciding vote. They chose the cheaper, more practical option over the expensive future they were told to buy. So, the war was over, and the victory of this open DDR standard created a legacy that, believe it or not, continues to shape the tech that all of us are using every single day. In 2001, facing a full-blown rebellion from its customers and partners, Intel had no choice. They had to surrender. The company put out new chipsets that supported DDR memory. And by doing that, they were basically raising the white flag. The open standard championed by the rebels had officially won. And that victory didn't just end the war, it kicked off this incredible chain of innovation. DDR didn't just win, it thrived, it evolved, getting faster and more efficient with every single generation, leading in a straight line from that initial David versus Goliath victory all the way to the DDR5 memory that powers today's most powerful computers. Every step you see here is a direct descendant of that rebel victory. And the impact here wasn't just technical, it was huge financially. By going with an open, royalty-free standard, the entire PC industry saved itself billions, with a B, billions of dollars in royalties that would have gone to Rambus. And that saving got passed on to us, to consumers, as more powerful and more affordable computers. So, what are the big takeaways from this whole crazy memory war? Well, first, just being technically superior on paper doesn't guarantee anything. Price and how something actually performs in the real world, that's what people care about. It also shows the incredible power of an open standard to rally an entire industry. But maybe the biggest lesson of all? It proves that even the most powerful company in the world can't just tell the market what to do. In the end, the customer is always the real kingmaker.
Picture this, the dot-com bubble has just burst, and the memory chip industry is an absolute bloodbath. Prices are plummeting, companies are going under left and right, and for a giant like Micron, this wasn't about growing the business, it was about pure, uncut survival. They were facing threats that could wipe them off the map, and what they did next, well, it wasn't a business plan, it was a masterclass in corporate warfare.
See, this wasn't a war fought with better products on a shelf. Oh no. This was a war of legal attrition, of strategic cunning, and of high-stakes gambles that would literally reshape the entire global memory market. Micron's story over this decade isn't really about better engineering, it's about a better and a more ruthless strategy.
So the first major assault, it didn't even come from a competitor. It came from a company that just held patents, a firm called Rambus, and it kicked off one of the longest and frankly, one of the nastiest legal brawls in the history of Silicon Valley.
So Rambus throws the first punch, right? They sue basically the entire industry, claiming everyone owed them billions for using standard DDR memory. But Micron, they didn't just play defense. They went on the attack, hitting back with a bombshell allegation. This wasn't just patent infringement, this was fraud.
In this one phrase, you guys, this became the smoking gun for Micron's entire case. Their lawyers dug up internal Rambus emails where employees were literally talking about creating a patent minefield. Those words were just explosive. It suggested a deliberate, calculated plan to trick the whole industry.
Micron's lawyers laid it all out. They argued that Rambus joined the group that was setting open tech standards for everyone, all while secretly filing patents on those exact technologies. And then came the knockout allegation that Rambus held shredding parties to destroy the paper trail. This wasn't a lawsuit anymore. This was all-out war.
And get this fight dragged on for over a decade. This wasn't some quick courtroom skirmish. Cases bounced back and forth between courts, draining millions of dollars. This was a war of endurance, a strategy designed to bleed your opponent completely dry.
So after more than 10 years of fighting, Micron finally settled. They paid out $280 million, which, is a huge number. But it was a tiny, tiny fraction of the billions with a B that Rambus had originally demanded. In the brutal math of corporate law, this was a massive win. But, while Micron was fighting that war in the courtroom, an even darker controversy was brewing behind the scenes. The US Department of Justice opened this massive investigation into a global price-fixing conspiracy. And guess who was right in the thick of it? Yep, Micron.
Facing fines that could have literally bankrupted them, Micron saw this incredible, high-stakes opening. See, the DOJ has this interesting little program. It's basically a get-out-of-jail-free card. The first company in a cartel to come clean, admit everything, and cooperate gets full amnesty. So, what do you think they did? They confessed. In 2002, Micron walked right into the Department of Justice and admitted that its own employees had been coordinating prices with their biggest competitors. It was an unbelievably audacious move, a massive risk that would turn their rivals into bitter enemies, probably forever.
Now, this wasn't a clean getaway. One of their own execs had to take the fall and pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice. But the gamble paid off spectacularly. By becoming the government's star witness, Micron had set the perfect trap for all of its competitors.
And the result? Just look at this. It's absolutely stunning. Micron walked away paying $0 in criminal fines. Meanwhile, its rivals, Samsung, Hynix, you name it, they were forced to plead guilty and pay over $730 million combined. Micron literally weaponized the government's own rules to financially cripple the competition.
So with its two biggest threats completely neutralized, Micron's whole strategy shifted. It wasn't about defense anymore, it was about offense. It wasn't about surviving, it was about conquering. They started using strategic acquisitions to build an empire on the ashes of their rivals.
And their playbook was crystal clear. Step 1, secure manufacturing in Asia. That's where the whole supply chain was headed. Step 2, diversify. They saw the smartphone revolution coming and knew they had to get beyond just DRAM memory and into the next big thing, flash memory. And that led to step 3, a massive $1.27 billion acquisition of a company called Mnemonics.
Now, this wasn't just about getting bigger, it was about getting the right tech. This one deal gave Micron the complete portfolio of memory products they needed for the new mobile era. And the impact of this move was just transformative. You can see it right here. Before 2010, Micron was basically a one-trick pony. Their entire fate was tied to the insane up and down swings of the DRAM market.
After that mnemonics deal, their portfolio was diversified, it was resilient, and they were perfectly positioned for the explosion in smartphones and tablets.
So when you put it all together, the legal wars, that insane amnesty maneuver, the sharp acquisitions, you start to see this clear formula emerge. This is how Micron didn't just survive one of the toughest decades in tech history, but how they became a global powerhouse. The takeaways are just so clear. They showed that you can shut down existential threats with aggressive legal counterattacks. They proved you can use the government's own programs to turn the tables on an entire industry. And they demonstrated that smart acquisitions are the key to not just growth, but long-term survival. At its core, their story is about being willing to take huge, calculated risks when your back is against the wall.
So, you gotta ask yourself, right? How does a company that just makes components, the memory chips inside our computers and phones, suddenly become this crucial, strategic asset for national security? That's the big question we're digging into. And the answer is a crazy, decade-long journey that didn't just reshape the company, it totally changed its place on the world stage.
And this quote, it just nails Micron's new reality. We're not talking about basic storage anymore. The kind of high bandwidth memory they make is absolutely essential for training the massive AI models that are powering, well, everything these days. It just goes to show you how far they've come.
I mean, look at this contrast. It's night and day. On one side, you've got the old Micron. It was all about brutal cost per bit economics, just trying to survive these insane boom and bust cycles. And then there's the new Micron, a strategic fortress, a linchpin for AI, and a key player in this fight for technological sovereignty, which is basically a fancy way of saying a country can control its own tech. The change is just massive. So what on earth happened?
Well, the catalyst for all this change wasn't some brilliant business plan or a market forecast. Nope, it was a tragedy. A single, shocking event that happened on the morning of February 3rd, 2012, that completely and irrevocably changed the company's future.
So let's just walk through what happened that morning. Steve Appleton, he was Micron's charismatic CEO, had been for 2 decades. He was also a very accomplished pilot. He was flying this experimental, super high-performance aircraft. He actually aborted his first takeoff. Then he tried again, but just moments after getting in the air, the engine failed. He tried to turn back to the runway, but the plane stalled and crashed. Appleton was killed instantly.
And here's the detail that puts it all into perspective: the altitude. He was only at 300 feet. At that height, there is absolutely zero margin for error. An engine failure is catastrophic because you have no time, no space, no options to recover. That number really tells you how impossible the situation was.
There's actually a name for the maneuver Appleton attempted. Pilots call it the impossible turn. When you try to crank the plane around to get back to the runway at such a low altitude, it's incredibly easy to cause the wings to lose lift. That leads to something called an aerodynamic stall, and from that low, there's just no recovery. It's a desperate, last-ditch move that almost never works.
Appleton's sudden death left this massive hole in the company. Everyone was in shock, and its future was completely up in the air. And the man who had to step up and lead them through it all was, by some bizarre twist of fate, probably the last person you'd expect at that exact moment. And get this is the unbelievable part. Mark Durkan, who was the company's president and COO, had announced he was retiring just 7 days earlier. Can you imagine? He was probably boxing up his office, making plans for his future, and instead, he's suddenly thrust into the CEO role, forced to put everything on hold and steer the company through its absolute darkest hour. And this right here perfectly illustrates the huge shift in leadership. Appleton was the maverick, the charismatic pilot who was Micron for years. Durkan was different, a chemical engineer by training. He was the steady hand, the quiet, deep, strategic thinker. And as it turns out, his leadership style was exactly what Micron needed, not just to survive, but to completely rebuild itself. So, with Durkan at the helm, Micron started this very deliberate, methodical transformation. They launched a new strategy designed to escape the past and build a defensible fortress for the future.
Now, to really get their strategy, you have to understand this term. The memory industry was a bloodbath. It was this constant race to the bottom. Companies would flood the market with cheap chips, prices would totally collapse, and the weaker players would just go bankrupt. It was a vicious cycle Micron had been stuck in for decades. Durkan's #1 goal was to break that cycle for good.
And here's the playbook he executed. First, he consolidated the whole industry by buying a huge Japanese competitor called Elpida. That meant fewer players and more stable prices. Second, he ended a really complicated partnership with Intel. Third, he got serious about facing the new reality of state-sponsored industrial espionage. And finally, the masterstroke. He pivoted the entire company's focus toward the next big wave, the massive, insatiable demand for high-performance memory driven by AI.
So this brings us full circle. This whole journey isn't just a business case study you'd read in a textbook. It's a story that has huge implications for global technology and, frankly, for global security.
And if there's one thing to take away, it's this: semiconductors are the new oil. It's that simple. The country that controls the design and manufacturing of these advanced chips holds an incredible amount of power. By surviving and transforming itself, Micron basically ensured that the United States kept a critical capability in this new great game.
Which brings us to Micron's new identity. After a decade of rebuilding, of smart, strategic moves, it's not just another company anymore. It has become a fortress, a vital stronghold in the American semiconductor industry, securing a critical piece of the global tech supply chain.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into an absolute masterclass in corporate strategy. We're talking about how a single, incredibly bold $2.5 billion bet didn't just save a company from the brink, but completely redrew the map for an entire global industry. This is the story of Micron's game-changing gambit. Okay, so to really get what was going on, you have to picture the scene back in the early 2010s. The global memory chip market was in a state that people inside the industry were calling, and I'm quoting here, a destructive bloodbath of competition.
So before we can appreciate just how brilliant Micron's move was, we really need to understand the world they were trying to survive in. It was pure chaos. I mean, this was an industry that was literally eating itself alive. At the very heart of all this chaos was a completely fractured market. You had this huge, crowded field of companies from Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, the US, all just desperately clawing at each other for the same piece of the pie.
And you know what happens when you have too many people selling basically the same thing, right? You get brutal, relentless price wars. It got so bad that companies were actually selling memory chips for less than it cost them to make them. Just think about that.
The main takeaway here is pretty simple. This whole war of attrition was a lose-lose situation for everybody. It was just a race to the bottom that was absolutely torching profits across the entire industry. Something had to give.
Really, there was only one logical way out of this death spiral. The industry had to consolidate. It needed to become more stable, more rational. It needed to become an oligopoly. And that's when Micron steps onto the stage. In 2013, they made their move. They launched this massive, high-stakes gambit to buy a bankrupt Japanese memory maker called Elpida. And this was the moment that was going to change absolutely everything.
So, what was the price tag? A cool $2.5 billion. And that's including the debt that Micron had to absorb. Now, that might not sound like a crazy number by today's tech standards, but for Micron back in 2013, this was a total all-in bet the company kind of move. Okay, but this is where the genius of the deal really starts to shine. Look at how they structured the payments. It was brilliant. They only paid a relatively small amount up front. And then, this is the masterstroke, they arranged to pay the rest of it over time, using the cash that was being generated by the very factories they were buying. Just an incredible piece of financial engineering.
And the payoff? It was immediate and it was immense. By absorbing Elpida and a Taiwanese joint venture they were part of, Micron's total manufacturing capacity just exploded by 45%. In the blink of an eye, they went from being a mid-level player to a true global heavyweight. But this whole deal, it was about way more than just getting bigger factories or more production capacity.
The real prize, kind of the hidden gem in this whole thing, was something far more strategic.
So you have to ask the question, right? Was this just a land grab for manufacturing power? Was the whole point just to make more chips, or was Micron playing a much longer, much smarter game?
And this right here illustrates the real prize. Before the deal, Micron was dominant in the PC market, which, let's be honest, was starting to slow down. Elpida, on the other hand, well, they held the keys to the kingdom. They were plugged into the exploding mobile market because they were a key supplier to the most important customer in the entire world, Apple.
So, by acquiring Elpida, Micron effectively acquired Apple as a customer. And the impact? It was just seismic. You can see it on this chart. Their mobile business shot up from less than 10% of their revenue to over 30%. This wasn't just growth, it was a fundamental reinvention of the entire company, basically future-proofing them against the decline of the PC.
And with that one single masterstroke, Micron didn't just save itself. It helped forge an entirely new world order for the entire global memory industry.
And here it is. This is the New World Order. That bloodbath was officially a thing of the past. The industry had finally consolidated into a stable oligopoly, with three titans at the top: Samsung, SK Hynix, and the new, much more powerful Micron. For the first time in years, the market had some discipline, some real stability.
You know, the brilliance of this move wasn't just financial, it was also cultural. Successfully merging a hard-charging American company from Idaho with a legacy Japanese tech giant, well, that's a feat in itself. A lot of mergers like this fail. But Micron navigated these really tricky waters with incredible finesse, keeping the top engineering talent and even turning Elpida's Hiroshima facility into its global center for mobile R&D.
So, what should you really take away from all this? Well, the legacy of this deal is truly a masterclass in corporate strategy, in perfect timing, and in really, really smart integration.
I mean, think about it. This one strategic gambit took an entire industry on a journey from pure, destructive chaos to a stable, consolidated structure in just a few short years. And it put Micron in the absolute perfect position to capitalize on the massive tech boom that was just around the corner.
All right, let's dive into a real tech mystery. This is a story that's got everything: a groundbreaking invention, a gamble worth billions, and a jaw-dropping decision to just pull the plug. So that's the big question, right? Why on earth would a company kill a piece of tech that was supposed to be 1,000 times faster than what we already have? It sounds crazy, but the answer? Well, it turns out to be a masterclass in business strategy. And believe it or not, that's exactly what happened. Back in 2021, the tech giant Micron did just that. They just walked away from the revolutionary 3D XPoint memory. This sent, you can imagine, total shockwaves through the industry. Now, to really get why they did it, we first have to understand what this amazing technology was supposed to be. Okay, so let's start at the end of the story, a revolution's end. We're talking about that shocking decision that ended this multi-billion-dollar bet. And look, this wasn't just them hitting the pause button. No, this was a full-on dead stop. Micron announced they were ceasing all development of 3D XPoint, and they were selling the factory that made it. It was over. Done. The finality of it was just stunning. So to really appreciate how big of a deal this was, we gotta jump in the time machine and go back to 2015, back to when this was being called the miracle memory. And the promise here was just staggering. I mean, listen to this. 3D XPoint was supposedly 1,000 times faster than the standard NAND storage you've got in your SSDs in your phones right now. This wasn't just a little speed bump. This was being hailed as a whole new category of memory, the first in decades. So what problem was this miracle tech actually trying to solve? Well, it was created to be what's called storage class memory, or SCM for short. The easiest way to think about it is like this. Your computer has two main types of memory. You've got your super fast RAM, that's DRAM, but it forgets everything when you turn the power off. Then you've got your much slower storage, that's NAND, which keeps all your files safe. There's this massive performance gap between the two. 3D XPoint was designed to be the perfect bridge, right in the middle of that gap. And here's a look at that memory hierarchy. You've got the fastest stuff, DRAM, on one end, super expensive, but it loses your data. On the other end, you've got slow NAND storage, cheap, and it holds onto your data. And right there in that sweet spot was 3D XPoint. It was designed to be fast, to keep your data when the power was off, and all at a medium cost. It was literally supposed to be the best of both worlds. But there was a problem, a big one. This miracle memory was born from a partnership between two tech giants, Intel and Micron, and it turns out they had two very, very different ideas for its future. And this is where things get messy. Intel, who called their version Optane, wanted to build a walled garden. Their goal was to use this amazing tech to lock customers into buying their expensive Xeon CPUs for data centers. But Micron, their goal was totally different. They're a memory company. They needed to sell this stuff to everybody, using open standards to sell as much as possible. You can see the problem, right? These two strategies just could not coexist. So the partnership was on shaky ground. That was one problem. But another, arguably even bigger one, was rearing its head. The brutal, cold, hard economic reality of this whole thing. You know that huge, dedicated factory they built for this stuff in Utah? Well, the customers just never showed up. The demand they expected, it never happened. So this factory was just sitting there, not making nearly enough product, and it quickly turned into a massive financial weight around Micron's neck. And when I say a massive weight, I mean it. We're talking about a loss of about $400 million per year, just from that one factory not running at full steam. No matter how big you are, you just can't keep bleeding that much cash. The tech could be the coolest thing in the world, but numbers like that are impossible to ignore.
And to make matters worse, the competition wasn't just sitting on the sidelines. The old technology, 3D NAND, was getting better and cheaper fast. The cost per bit was just plummeting. Meanwhile, the cost for 3D XPoint was stubbornly high, so the very gap it was designed to fill was getting squeezed from below. The whole reason for it to exist was disappearing.
Okay, so let's recap. You've got a failing partnership, you've got devastating financial losses. Micron was truly at a crossroads. And this is where the story takes a turn. It stops being about a cool piece of tech and starts being about a really smart, really tough business decision. The strategic divorce didn't happen overnight. It was a slow burn. First, in 2018, they decided to stop developing the tech together. Then, in 2019, Micron actually bought Intel's share of the factory. Think about that for a second. Now Micron owned the only factory making a product for a customer that was also its biggest competitor. It was an impossible situation, and it all came to a head with that final decision in 2021. So what happened after they made that incredibly tough call to quit? The payoff was huge, and it was immediate. First off, that $400 million a year bleeding stopped instantly. They sold the factory to Texas Instruments for a cool $900 million. And all that money, all those brilliant engineers, they could now focus on what they do best, their core DRAM and NAND business. It was a perfect example of not throwing good money after bad.
You know, sometimes this story comes along that sounds like it's straight out of a Hollywood spy movie. We're talking about a high-stakes corporate heist, a little international espionage, and a geopolitical showdown between two global superpowers. This is the story of how one of America's biggest chip makers had to fight a war on two fronts, in the courtroom and in the halls of power.
So, let's just start with the price tag on this whole thing. Get this, $8.75 billion. That's the estimated value of the intellectual property that was stolen. To give you some perspective, that is a huge amount of money, more than many massive companies spent on all their research and development in a year. This wasn't just grabbing some files. This was an attempt to steal a company's entire future.
So, you've got to be asking, right? What in the world could possibly be worth that much money? And how could a competitor even get their hands on it? Well, that's exactly the story we're going to unpack. Let's dive in.
Okay, let's rewind the clock to 2016. A plan was put into motion to steal the absolute crown jewels from Micron Technology, a giant in the American semiconductor world. And let me be clear, this wasn't some spur-of-the-moment crime. Oh no, this was a carefully calculated plot designed to jump ahead of years and years of super expensive, painstaking research.
To really get what happened here, you have to understand who was involved. This was not the work of some lone wolf or a single rogue actor. It was a coordinated effort between 3 different companies, and each one had a very specific role to play in this whole scheme.
All right, so there were 3 main players on this chessboard. First, you have Micron, the American company, basically the victim, with all the cutting-edge tech. Then there's United Microelectronics Corporation, or UMC, a Taiwanese company that acted as the middleman, the accomplice, whose job was to poach the right people. And finally, you have Fujian Jinhua, the company that was going to get all the goods, a state-backed Chinese firm that was pretty much set up to receive this stolen technology. And who was the guy connecting all the dots? A man named Stephen Chen. And here's the kicker. He used to be a site director for Micron in Taiwan. He leaves, becomes a senior exec at UMC, and then gets appointed president of Fujian Jinhua. So he knew Micron's tech inside and out, but more importantly, he knew the people who built it.
So the big prize here, what was it all for? It was for something called DRAM technology. Now, DRAM is basically the super fast memory that powers everything from your smartphone to massive cloud data centers. Making this stuff is incredibly complex, requires billions of dollars, and takes years of work. Fuji and Jinhua wanted to just skip all that, and Micron's secrets were the perfect shortcut.
And the way they did it, I mean, it was incredibly brazen. First, Chen and UMC went after Micron's top engineers.
As these engineers were walking out the door for the last time, they were downloading hundreds of secret files. We're talking everything from design plans to manufacturing processes onto personal USB drives and cloud accounts. Then they take that data to UMC, use special off-network laptops to wipe any trace of where it came from, and then funnel it right into Fuji and Jinhua's new project.
But here's the thing. Micron wasn't just going to roll over and take this. The company launched an absolutely ferocious counteroffensive. This wasn't just about filing a lawsuit. No, this was an all-out war, and they fought it on two fronts, in the legal system and at the highest levels of the US government.
Micron's counterattack kicked off in the courts, with lawsuits filed in both the US and Taiwan. But things escalated really fast. The US Department of Justice got involved, launching its own federal investigation and calling it state-sponsored economic espionage. And that's when the Department of Commerce decided to bring out its biggest weapon.
And that weapon? It has a name. The Entity List. Now, you might have heard of this, but let me break it down. For a tech company, getting on this list is basically a death sentence. Seriously, once you're on it, you are cut off from buying critical American technology, software, and equipment. For a company trying to build a brand new chip factory, this is absolutely, totally crippling.
So in 2018, bam, the hammer comes down, Fuji and Jinhua get slapped on the Entity List, and its operations pretty much grind to a halt. 2 years later, the accomplice, UMC, pleads guilty. All of this was setting the stage for the final showdown, the 2024 court verdict for Fuji and Jinhua itself.
All right, so let's set the stage for the final act. You've got the accomplice who's already confessed, you have all this evidence. The outcome of the trial against Fuji and Jinhua seemed like a total foregone conclusion. But what happened next was a shocking twist that came down to a very, very fine legal line.
Yeah, just to remind you, back in 2020, UMC had already thrown in the towel. They pleaded guilty and agreed to pay a $60 million fine. It was a massive admission of wrongdoing from a key player in this whole conspiracy.
So you've got the accomplice on the record admitting they did it. The case against the main company, the one that was going to benefit from the whole thing, that's got to be a slam dunk, right? It just has to be.
Nope, absolutely not. In a move that shocked pretty much everyone following this case, in February 2024, a U.S. district judge acquitted Fuji and Jinhua of all charges. After years of fighting, the main target was found not guilty.
So wait a minute, how is that even possible? Well, the court's logic was actually very specific. The judge said, yes, the individual engineers definitely stole secrets. And yes, their new employer, UMC, was guilty. But, and this is the key, prosecutors couldn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Fuji and Jinhua, as a company, had actually ordered the theft. Legally, that's the difference between being the lucky recipient of a crime and being the mastermind behind it.
But, and this is maybe the most important part of the whole story, while Fuji and Jinhua may have won that specific legal battle in court, the real war, well, that had already been lost on a much bigger geopolitical battlefield.
Why? Because the real-world consequences were devastating for them. Those sanctions from way back in 2018 getting put on the Entity List, they had already done their job. Fuji and Jinhua's plans were completely stalled. It was basically dead in the water years before a judge ever issued a verdict. And in the process, Micron sent a crystal clear message to the whole industry. We will use every single tool we have to protect our technology.
There's a great quote that really just sums this all up perfectly. Micron was no longer just competing in a market, it was a combatant in a geopolitical struggle. This case totally changed how the company, and really the whole industry, thought about risk.
Ultimately, what this whole Micron-Jinhua saga did was draw a map for the new reality we're in. The lines have completely blurred. Corporate boardrooms and R&D labs are now a front line in the massive tech rivalry between the United States and China.
You know, in the semiconductor world, it is absolutely cutthroat. You either lead, you follow, or you just get out of the way. But what happens when you're suddenly all on your own and you have to forge a completely new path?
So, let's set the stage. It's 2019. Micron's long-term tech partnership with Intel, it's over. It's dissolved. And suddenly the company is in this sink or swim moment. They had to prove, not just to the market, but to themselves, that their own internal R&D was world-class and that they could really lead the industry all by themselves.
So the big question is, how do you compete with giants when you're suddenly the one going it alone? Well, Micron figured out pretty quickly that the answer wasn't just to play catch-up. No, it was to fundamentally change the game they were playing. Instead of just following the same path as everyone else, they decided they were going to find a smarter, way more innovative way forward.
Okay, so their first major pivot, it happened in the world of NAND flash memory. And if you're not familiar, that's the stuff that's inside your smartphone, and it's what powers the massive data centers that run our entire digital world.
For years and years, the industry standard was this technology called floating gate. It worked great for a long time, but as companies kept trying to stack more and more layers of memory to get more storage, they just hit a brick wall. Think of it like a skyscraper with paper-thin walls between the apartments. Eventually, you just get too much noise bleeding through. In this case, the memory cells started interfering with each other, and the whole approach became a technological dead end.
And what's really fascinating here is that while Micron's competitors had already moved on to newer designs, Micron looked like it was stuck with this old tech. But then, boom, in 2020, they pulled off this absolutely flawless pivot. They didn't just catch up, they leapfrogged the entire industry.
The result of that massive pivot can really be summed up with just one number: 176. That was the number of layers in their brand new 3D NAND memory. It was a complete watershed moment that established Micron as the new leader in memory density.
So how in the world did they pull this off? Well, the secret was some incredibly clever engineering. Let's go back to that data skyscraper analogy. Instead of putting all the controls and the logic in a separate building next door, which takes up a ton of space, Micron figured out how to build it all in the basement, directly underneath the memory stack. It's a technology called CMOS under array. So what did this whole controls in the basement idea actually get them? First off, a 30% reduction in the physical size of the chip. This is huge because it meant they could fit way more storage onto every single silicon wafer, giving them this massive cost advantage.
But it wasn't just smaller and cheaper. That exact same design also delivered a 35% improvement in read and write speeds. And for their main target market, those booming data centers, that combination of density and raw performance was an absolute killer feature. Bet number one had paid off big time.
But Micron wasn't done yet. Not even close. If the NAND pivot was a brilliant leapfrog, their next move in the DRAM memory space was an even riskier gamble. I mean, this one pitted them directly against the entire industry's consensus.
So for this challenge, the whole industry was facing a totally different kind of physical wall. Chip manufacturing at its core is basically a form of photography, right? You're using light to etch these incredibly tiny circuits. The problem was, the features on the chips were becoming smaller than the actual wavelength of light being used to create them. That is a fundamental problem.
The industry's solution? It was a new, unbelievably complex technology called extreme ultraviolet lithography, or EUV. And the price tag for a single one of these machines was a jaw-dropping $150 million. So here was the big choice. The rest of the industry, they started pouring billions into buying up these new EUV machines. Micron, on the other hand, chose a completely contrarian path. They basically said, you know what? Not yet. Instead, they decided to double down on perfecting their existing tools, using these really clever multi-patterning techniques. It's kind of like painting the circuit lines in multiple overlapping passes to push the old technology further than anyone thought was even possible.
Now, a lot of people in the industry saw this as a massive risk, a sure sign that Micron was going to fall behind. But what actually happened? Well, it was like they were challenging the very laws of physics.
And the results. Remember, all of this was achieved without using those expensive EUV machines. The results were just staggering. A 35% increase in density, a 15% improvement in power efficiency, and they delivered the world's most advanced mobile memory for smartphones. They basically matched the competition's performance, but without that enormous price tag.
And you don't have to take my word for it. This is what Micron's own VP of DRAM process integration, Thai Tran, said about it. She called it challenging the laws of physics. It was the ultimate proof that Micron's R&D engine wasn't just surviving on its own, it was absolutely thriving, firing on all cylinders. So when you step back and look at these two stories together, you see something more than just a couple of technical wins. The NAND leapfrog and the DRAM gamble. These were the two pivots that really forged a new, completely independent identity for Micron.
The pattern here is crystal clear. In NAND, they hit a physical limit, so they bet on a smarter design and won. In DRAM, they hit the limits of light itself, so they bet against buying expensive new tools, and they won again, with world-class performance and efficiency. Two totally different problems, but one successful strategy. Innovate on your own terms.
So let me ask you this. What do you think is the most valuable real estate in the whole world of AI? I mean, if you had to bet, you'd probably say the processor, the GPU, right? And hey, for years, you would have been absolutely correct.
But the game has totally changed. The real bottleneck, the most valuable piece of property, so to speak,
It's not the processor anymore. No, the real prize, the thing that's holding everything back, and the key to unlocking what's next for AI, it's the memory that sits right next to the processor. The speed, the efficiency of that memory, that's what's now setting the pace for the entire AI revolution.
Wild, right?
Okay, so this whole thing really exploded back in 2023. You might remember, the markets for stuff like phones and PCs were kind of slowing down. But then, this new, absolutely insatiable hunger emerged from the world of generative AI. These new large language models, they didn't just need more memory, they needed a completely different kind of memory, and they needed just staggering amounts of it. And boom, just like that, it kicked off a modern-day gold rush.
And the technology at the very heart of this gold rush? It's called high bandwidth memory, or HBM for short. Now, the best way to get your head around this is to stop thinking about memory like a big, sprawling, single-story warehouse for data. Instead, picture a skyscraper, a data skyscraper. That's what HBM is. It's memory chips stacked vertically, one on top of the other, to create this super dense, super fast pipeline of information that sits right next to the AI processor.
And how they build this thing is honestly ingenious. You start with a base, like the foundation of the skyscraper, then you just start stacking layers of DRAM memory vertically. And to get between the floors, you have these super fast data elevators. The technical name is through-silicon vias, or TSVs, which are basically these microscopic tunnels that go straight through the silicon. It's this whole vertical design that's the secret sauce behind its incredible speed.
So for years and years, if you were building the best AI chips and you needed the best HBM, you really only had one phone call to make. You called SK Hynix. They had this exclusive partnership with NVIDIA, the undisputed king of AI hardware. And that deal gave them what seriously looked like an unbreakable monopoly on this supercritical market.
But while everyone was watching the king on the throne, this unlikely contender was quietly working in the background, getting ready to rewrite all the rules. That company was Micron. And, well, they had a secret weapon that pretty much nobody saw coming.
So when Micron finally launched its next-gen HBM3E memory, at first glance, it didn't really look like a revolution. I mean, look at the specs, the bandwidth, the pin speed. It's all pretty much in line with what the competitors were offering. Nothing to write home about, right? But the secret, the real magic, wasn't in the speed. It was hidden right there in that last row. Power efficiency.
30%. Just let that sink in. This one number was about to change absolutely everything.
So what does that mean? It means Micron's memory could do all the same incredible work as its competitors, but using 30% less power. Now for just one chip, okay, that's a nice little saving. But think about a massive AI data center. We're talking thousands and thousands of these chips running 24/7. Your power bills are already in the millions, and heat is your mortal enemy. In that world, a 30% efficiency gain isn't just a nice little advantage, it is a total, complete game changer.
All right, so this incredible efficiency advantage, it set the stage for the climax of this whole story. This was the ultimate test. Could Micron take this one killer feature and use it to convince the most important AI company on the planet to break a rock-solid exclusive partnership and bet on their technology instead?
And to really get the stakes here, you have to understand just how powerful NVIDIA is. Their AI accelerators, their GPUs, I'm not exaggerating when I say they are the most sought-after pieces of hardware on the entire planet. So getting your component inside one of their chips, that's not just a sale, that is the ultimate validation. It's the seal of approval for the entire tech world.
And like we said, for years, NVIDIA had relied on one single trusted partner, SK Hynix, to supply the memory for these crown jewel products. It was one of the most stable, most locked-in relationships in the entire industry. They were set.
Until it wasn't.
And then the announcement dropped, and it sent absolute shockwaves through the industry. NVIDIA made it official. Micron's HBM3E was going to be integrated into their next-generation H200 GPUs. Just like that, the monopoly was shattered. Micron hadn't just gotten a sale. They had arrived on the world's biggest stage.
So, what happens next? Well, the consequences of this one deal were immediate, and they were huge. This didn't just change things for Micron, it completely redrew the map for the entire high-performance memory industry. Let's talk money first. The financial impact was just staggering. Suddenly, projections had Micron's revenue exploding, heading towards a record $37.4 billion. This wasn't just, a good quarter.
This was a fundamental reevaluation of the entire company, almost overnight.
And this win completely turned Micron's business model upside down. For years, this was a company that relied on the very volatile PC and mobile markets. All of a sudden, their data center business, which is basically all AI at this point, surged to become 56% of their total revenue, a complete flip.
And of course, the market share numbers followed. Now, SK Hynix, they still held on to the top spot. But Micron? They just leapfrogged right over their other massive competitor, Samsung, to become the solid number 2 player. This left Samsung, one of the biggest tech companies in the world, scrambling to figure out how to catch up.
So you have to ask, how did this even happen? Was this just a lucky break for Micron? Did they just stumble into some incredible breakthrough at the exact right moment?
The answer is a hard no. This was not luck. The secret to Micron's victory wasn't some sudden eureka moment. It was the result of years and years of foundational work on a manufacturing process. A process that, get this, was originally designed for something completely different: mobile phones.
This is the brilliant long game that Micron played. See, years ago, they perfected this process for making mobile chips. And in mobile, power efficiency is everything, right? You gotta save that battery life. Well, that obsession with efficiency naturally gave their chips a thermal advantage. They just ran cooler. So when they took that same exact process and applied it to building these HBM data skyscrapers, it meant their memory could handle heat way better. And that allowed them to build denser, more powerful, and more reliable HBM. A bet they made for the phone in your pocket ended up paying off in the most advanced, power-hungry data centers on Earth. Incredible.
And all of this leaves us with a really fascinating question for the future. For decades, we've always thought of the processor companies, the Intels, the NVIDIAs, as the undisputed kings of the tech world. But as AI's appetite for data just keeps growing and growing, could it be that the companies building the memory to feed those processors are about to become the new royalty of Silicon Valley?